Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is my slow march of the penguins through my Penguin Classic wall. We were interrupted for a few days while the Bean and I went on vacation, but we are now picking up where we left off in the ancient world of Greece and Rome. And the author that we're dealing with today is from the 2nd century BC. He was born in Libya, and he was a slave. He was brought to Rome as a slave and ran around in households and did all sorts of events, and menial tasks of one kind or another, may have been sold more than once. But when he became a young man, something happened that you can't predict, and that has nothing to do with his personal achievement. It's totally impersonal as an effect, and it can change everything. That is as true today as it was in his day, and that was that when he became a young man, he became beautiful. He was beautiful. And that opened doors. He was given an education. He was given access to the highest rank of society, to the very best people who wanted him around because of how gorgeous he was, and the education took because he was also sharp as a tack. So when you think about those factors, when it comes to the author, Terence, the author we know as Terence, your heart should break a little. Because of all the really sharp, really retentive young women, who were slaves in Rome and maybe had his skill and his wit and cleverness, but didn't have his calling card. They didn't grow up beautiful. But he did. And he fell into the social circle of the son of the famous Scipio, the Scipio, the Roman general who defeated Alexander the Great and accepted his surrender. And that was the highest, that was the cream of Roman society at the time. They knew all the movers and shakers. They went to beautiful villas for the summer. They went to all the sporting events. They lived exactly the kind of life that a slave in Terence's position would have seen from a distance every once in a while. Just a glimpse here and there at a distance. Only he got to live in that world and work in that world. He not only got to live in that world, he got to write in that world, and did. And this is not a Roman fresco, but it's awful close, and it isn't from Roman Libya. It's from Roman Egypt. But the point of this Penguin Classic is introduced and translated by Betty Radis, who was a great mover and shaker in Penguin Classics and does a fantastic job here. And the choice for this cover is fairly straightforward, and it is to emphasize the fact that this was an ancient figure, an author of the ancient world who was very good looking. That's the whole point of this. As close as we're going to come to, this is not probably anything like what Terence looked like, but the point is that in this Penguin Classic, when you pick it up, you are immediately aware of that calling card. You can see it right away, just the way everyone who knew Terence would have seen it. And Betty Radis does a wonderful job with these. There are 6 comedies in here, and she does a wonderful job with them, but we're going to get to a problem with translating. We're going to get to that later on. But the 2 things that we talk about on your Daily Penguin are issues of translation and also the Pitiless Ratio, the tiny winding thread by which a lot of these ancient works come to us at all. The tiny, tiny unlikelihood that we are even talking about someone like Catullus or Propertius, that we have even a little of their work to read, when we know how many dozens and dozens and dozens of their contemporary writers and poets, where we know the name and we don't have anything of the work, and by that you can extrapolate how many of the names we don't know, how many people have vanished literally without any trace at all. And we're talking about big people too here. I mean, Livy was famous in his day. Tacitus was famous as an author in his day, in addition to being famous as a public man. And yet there are parts of their work that are missing. And this is the point where you might expect me to go on about the Pitiless Ratio when it comes to Terence. But in fact, no. In fact, Terence is one of the only figures from the ancient world who, if you brought him forward in time and dressed him in skinny jeans and a lightweight leather jacket and brought him to the Harvard bookstore and showed him his Loeb Classical Library edition so that he could look at his own work in a language that he can read, he's pretty much the only figure from the ancient world who would look at that volume and say, yeah, this looks fine to me. If Catullus came forward and dressed in skinny jeans and a leather jacket and looked at his volume, the best we could hope that he would say would be, Where's all the rest of it? The worst case scenario, if he did, would be, who's this? It would be if you look at him, a Propertius, looked at it and said, I have no idea what this is. I never wrote any of this, and nothing that I wrote is in this book. That would be horrifying, and could be true. But with Terence, he only wrote 6 plays. And we not only have an excellent literary tradition for those plays, we have them, we know what they were like, but we also have everything else. We have everything we need to know about them. They come with production notes. Production notes. We know when they were first staged. We know when they were written. We know the names of the men who produced them and the exact year in which they were produced. We know the name of the slave who wrote the music. That is uncanny. That kind of survival is uncanny. That almost never happens. But it happened with Terence. So, for once, when you are reading the Penguin Classic volume, you do not have to break your heart. Because you're not reading it's not like he wrote 70 plays or 120 plays. We've seen those things in Penguin Classics, these daily Penguins before. That is not true in Terence's case. So you don't have to worry about the Pitiless Ratio when it comes to this author. It's random chance. We've been talking about how it's random chance. It's obviously random chance because people who non-random chance should have favored suffer just as poorly, just as much as anybody else. Terence was popular in his day. His work was put on at big games and festivals. His plays earned money in his day. They probably earned him a great deal of money, and they weren't hurt any by the prominence of his social connections. But they're also really good. They deserve to survive. And that brings us to questions of translation. And you already know, if you've been watching your Daily Penguin, and I assume that some of you out there are very helpfully making playlists of these things, because I don't know how to do that yet. I'm assuming that you could just binge watch all of these Daily Penguins. There are lots more of them to go. Lots more. We aren't even out of the ancient world yet, for Pete's sake, and it's almost March. But we have been talking about translation, and if you've seen those earlier videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of Betty Radish. She does a fantastic job, not only as an editor, but as a translator. She is terrific. But, and she's also good in this volume. This volume is very good. But Terence, he was adapting other people's plays. He was adapting Greek plays. But he was very inventive and had a real ear for what he was doing. He invented, or not invented, but he perfected, for instance, the comedic subplot, which you will see today. Pick a comedy. Don't pick a highfalutin comedy. There's no use in doing that. I've seen it tried with Terence so many times. Pick an episode of Friends. A particularly well-constructed episode of Friends. Like the one where Chandler and Joey realize, or no, it's not Chandler and Joey, it's Ross and Joey, accidentally realize that they have the best midday nap of their entire lives when they nap together. They nap on top of each other, like a parent and child, or like a pair of lovers. They are not. They are not. In the show, they are both straight, but it doesn't matter. They accidentally stumble upon the fact. I think the episode is called "The One About the Nap" or something like that. I'm sure you know the episode I'm talking about. They actually accidentally stumble across the fact that the very best nap they could possibly imagine only happens when they do that, and they become addicted to it. But it's, of course, a secret. They can't tell their friends that they're napping together during the day. So they develop all sorts of coded language in order to sneak off and have a nap. And that is the primary comedic plot in that storyline. But there is a subplot. Nobody remembers it, but there is a subplot in that episode. Or, like, for instance, in that episode, you remember the main plot, and you know how it's going to end. You know exactly how it's going to end. But in other episodes, if we stick to Friends, which Terence would have understood completely, and he would have been making millions to write for a show like that, or Modern Family, or something like that, there's another episode of Friends where it's the subplot that you remember, and not the main plot. It's the secondary comedic. There's one episode where there's a secondary comedic plot where Phoebe torments Ross by implying that she doesn't believe in evolution, that she doesn't think there's any proof for it. That she realizes when she mentions it just briefly in passing and watches how it winds him up and just decides to keep doing it, just keep winding him up all throughout the episode. So something else is happening. There's a main comedic arc in that episode, but there's also that runs throughout it. It was perfectly done. And they do bind together. The plot lines do bind together, whether it's in Friends or whether it's on a big screen comedy, like a very ambitious example would be Notting Hill or something like that. And Terence laid the groundwork for a lot of that. He did a lot of that really well. It's so well that his plays still hold up. And they were much imitated throughout the Renaissance and after. I myself believe that the basic DNA of what we consider to be a comedic episode, so something that you sit and watch for a nice, discrete period that is self-contained and that has several comedic payoffs. I believe that most of the DNA that for what we consider that comes from Terence and one other person who we'll get to on this Daily Penguin, but mostly Terence. And the problem here, I mean, Betty Radis understands that, so that's not a problem. And she sees it clearly, so that's not a problem. And her translation is clear and very energetic, so that's not a problem. The problem is you need a very particular kind of thing in a translator to bring 100% of the potential of that forward. This is the same kind of problem that we have when we talk about great poetry. Ideally, what you would want to translate Virgil's Aeneid into English would be an English poet who, writing English poetry, is every bit as great as Virgil. And that is the reason why those matchups tend not to happen. Because what are the odds? So you need not only for the translator to be as talented as the original writer in the same kind of genre, but they'd also have to have the linguistic skills to pull off the translation. That's almost unheard of. That almost never happens. Once in a great while, I would put forward Sheheany's Beowulf as something like that, where a great modern poet, a modern poet who has every bit as much skill as the Beowulf poet, learns how to translate Beowulf into English. I would argue that that is an example. I could come up with a handful of others, but it's very rare. And unfortunately, Betty Radis is able to do the 80% that we need her to do, and that schools need her to do, if you're going to hand out this volume in schools, which has been done many times. I'm not sure if Penguin makes Terence anymore, and I don't know if I want to know. But the extra 20%, she cannot do. She tries. But the extra 20%, some would say, is where the magic is where the magic of why these things were so beloved in their own day resides. And it doesn't always come through in her. And I believe that Oxford World Classics also does a volume of Terence, and I forget who translates them. It could be Ian Scott Kilvert, but it doesn't come across there either. It doesn't, unfortunately. Which kind of makes sense in a way, right? If Betty Radis had that kind of skill at conceiving, staging, and conveying whip-smart, scene-by-scene comedy, she probably wouldn't have been an academic translator. She probably wouldn't have been an academic editor. She probably would have been making 10 times as much money doing something else. I wrote extensively on Terence years and years ago, and I made a lot of these points, and I made them in greater detail. So I'll try and find that. I've been having trouble finding some of the older works, the older pieces of mine that I did on these. All of you, you've been universal in saying that you want those, that you want at least links to those. Some of you have emailed me and said that you've been printing those out and making a folder. Well, I should warn you, that folder is going to become a book in very little time. I have written about most of these people at great length, not just the ancients, but the authors on Penguin Classics, whether it's the Penguin Classic edition or not. I've written a vast amount about these people in my life, so it'll be a big book by the time you're done. If you do make a book out of it, I would like a copy. But anyway, that is my only quibble with your Penguin Classic today. With your Daily Penguin today, I always like to end on whether or not, the volume is a success and whether or not I recommend it. I do recommend it. And my only quibble, it's not like I can point you elsewhere, because it's never happened. No one has ever done Terence with that 100%. The closest we get is this. And with that, 80% is mighty close, especially since it's the only question involved here. It's not like with so many other authors. We also have to deal with huge gaps in our understanding, huge damages to the textual history, the provenance of the thing. We don't have to think of any of that when it comes to Terence. We just have to consider how good a job you're going to do translating. So this is a volume to have, absolutely. I don't know, again, I forgot to check ahead of time. I don't know if Betty Radis is still the Penguin translation of Terence, or if they've gone on to somebody else. If they've gone on to somebody else, there's an active question about how much comedic insight that new translator will have. I'd have to check it out and see. But I can definitely recommend this volume. And that is your Daily Penguin for today. It is Terence, who you will like, even if, I mean, if you can read Shakespeare's comedies, where I argue that in most of his comedies that his own contemporaries found knee-slappingly funny, I would argue that at most 35, maybe 40% of the comedy comes through to the present day. And that is in your own language. If you can read those and be entertained by them, then you will be fine with Betty Radis's Terence. But that is your Penguin Classic for today. I'm going to wrap this up because I'm worried about bombarding you with endless videos. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.